I don't know how I'm going to do any lore. I don't know how any of us are going to talk about lore if we have to take Godefroy seriously. If we have to take Godefroy seriously and include him in every goddamn conversation when it comes to demigods, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just easier to ignore him. It's just easier to ignore him.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, I'd like to discuss the most untouchable piece of lore in Elden Ring, the existence of Godefroy the Grafted. In your journey across the lands between, you eventually stumble across an Evergaol tucked away in the southwest corner of the Altus Plateau. Upon entering the Evergaol, you are faced with a nonsensical sight. The words Godefroy the Grafted appear on screen, and the character to whom this title is given appears identical to Godric the Grafted in every respect except for the spectral hue giving him a phantom appearance. This makes no sense. You're probably saying to yourself, what the heck, Miyazaki? Are you serious? I know Elden Ring likes to repeat bosses, but this crosses a line. Now it's messing with the lore. This has got to be just asset reuse by lazy devs. What other explanation is there? Could he be some sort of spirit projection of Godric's? After all, Loretta and Godfrey have spirit doubles in Caria Manor and the Erdtree Sanctuary, respectively. Loretta's spirit doesn't use the more advanced archery spell that she developed after her journey to the Haligtree, and Godfrey's golden spirit wields an axe which hasn't yet been broken, indicating that these spirits might be something like memories of the past kept alive through magic. There's even an example of a spirit double involving an Evergaol. Festering Fingerprint Vike invades us near the Church of Inhibition, wielding Frenzy Flame incantations. But Roundtable Knight Vike sits in the Lord Contender's Evergaol in the mountaintops, wielding only Dragon Cult incantations. Perhaps the Phantom Invader is a Vike from the past, but the Evergaol Vike's armor has still been touched by the Three Fingers. And why would future Vike only exist as a phantom? Furthermore, what exactly happens when we invade or join other players' worlds anyway? Are we supposed to think that there's a lore reason for this, or just dismiss it as a gameplay concession? All of that aside, even if Godefroy were some kind of phantom projection of Godric's, why would he be called Godefroy? Why not just be called Godric? There are many aliases in the game, but these are all just disguises. They don't involve actual weird metaphysical doubles. Well, that's not entirely true. Malekith calls himself Gurranq, but you can kill Malekith, and Gurranq still remains in the Bestial Sanctum. By the way, how did he actually get up there in the sky? And why exactly did we need to break this enormous ginger cripple splint? Can't we just hop over to Caelid at the beginning of the game and beat up our canine clergyman until we get the Rune of Death? Whatever, we can dismiss all that because Farum Azula is special. It's outside of time or something. At least the other examples of aliases are just normal disguises, though. Nothing weird about them. Like, Margit is just a pseudonym for Morgott, right? Sure. Although, the Margit in the outer wall of Lendel still appears even after you kill Morgott, although the one in Stormveil disappears. The one in Lendel seems to take over the body of some random commoner. That's pretty weird. Morgott's brother, Moog, also has a double down in the Lendel sewers, but he doesn't bother to give himself an alias there. Oh, there's also another pair of Fellowman twins on the road to the Divine Tower that holds the benediction of Moog and Morgott's Great Runes. Actually, it's not exactly on the road, it's in an infinite black void that appears out of nowhere and kills this random soldier. That's also pretty weird. Okay, let's set aside Morgott and Margit for the moment. Maybe there's some weird omen magical stuff going on there. How about Godfrey? Godfrey calls himself Hoaraloo, but that's just sort of symbolic of the role he's playing. As Elden Lord, he's Godfrey, the civilized, genial leader of the lands between, but when the chips are down, he fights like an animal, so he needs a different name, I guess. Although it's a bit weird how he makes that transition. As Godfrey, he's got half of a spectral lion on his back, but when the going gets tough, Sarosh starts becoming real, and then Godfrey rips him apart, and their hands move in sync together. That's pretty weird. Godfrey also seems to have called himself Hoaraloo before. When he lost his grace, he was banished outside the lands between, presumably found a woman and had a kid named Nefeli, then got lynched along with his lion, if the intro sequence is reliable. It's interesting that his lion also got banished and also came back. What exactly was the whole purpose of that anyway? Okay, never mind Godfrey. How about Ronnie? When Ronnie first introduces herself, she calls herself Rena. Clearly this is just a pseudonym. Ronnie wants to disguise herself because she doesn't want to be found, I guess? Maybe she's just shy and tsundere. However, the three sisters behind Caria Manor include both Ronnie's rise and Rena's rise. So does that mean Rena was an actual person? Maybe she was the old snowy crone that taught Ronnie about the occult. After all, the Snow Witch outfit is in Rena's rise. Although, that would be a bit strange. Ronnie met the snowy crone deep in the woods to learn occult magic with her secret mentor. She's not very secret if she lives in your backyard, and why would you go to the woods if you could just go next door? The name Three Sisters might suggest Rena was Ronnie's sister. After all, there were other Carian princesses. Whatever happened to them, by the way? How come they never became demigod stepchildren of America? Well, in any case, Celivus is probably not Ronnie's sister, so there's probably a more reasonable explanation for all of this. Ronnie calls herself Rena for some reason, but otherwise, she's a perfectly normal girl. Well, she did kill her body and possess a doll. Actually, she possessed two dolls. At some point she falls asleep and pops into a really tiny doll down in the Ensel River, which you can only access through Rena's rise. Why does she need that tiny doll, exactly? Once you kill the guy who looks exactly like Blythe, but isn't Blythe further on, she says, "Farewell, my dear, tell Blythe and E.G. I love them," as if she's about to die. But then at Manicelis, she's back in her doll body, but without clothes. And then you put a ring on her finger, and she fades out and pops back in with clothes. Okay, I don't understand all these aliases and doubles, and this isn't helping contextualize Godefroy. So let's get back to the core issue. What do we know about Godefroy? What are the facts? Well, there's only one reference to Godefroy in the entire game, and it comes from the ancient dragon knight Kristoff Spirit Ash. The description reads, "Spirit of Kristoff, an honorable knight of Lendel who is also a devout worshipper of the ancient dragons. After the first defense of Lendel, Kristoff earned the hero's honor of Erdtree burial for the feat of capturing Godefroy the Grafted." Okay, so Godefroy was a real person. He actually existed in the real world, and Kristoff somehow captured him by putting him in an Everjail. Not entirely sure how he did that. Actually, Everjails are pretty strange. It's not just a box you stick someone inside. When you enter one, it's as if you transport to some parallel reality that looks exactly the same as the outside, except that the sky is a black void without stars, and even the Erdtree is occluded. On the ground there's this sinister purple rift, which looks a lot like the design on the Rift Shield, and that shield is the starting shield for the Prisoner class. The shield's description says that it's an antiquated charm which stares back at an enemy, and it boosts focus, which is your resistance to sleep and madness. Data miner Sekiro Dubi unearthed the questline involving Kale and his brothers, in which the madness of frenzy would sort of blend the identities of the nomads together, the lines between them burning bit by bit. The reason they play their instruments is because Saint Trina's song calms the flames somewhat, allowing them to remain themselves. Saint Trina is associated with sleep, and the icons for sleep and madness in-game are a closed and open eye, respectively. Maybe that has something to do with how the Rift Shield stares back at an enemy. And maybe this helps explain some weird identity thing going on with Everjails. But that's all cut content, so who knows? And anyway, Everjails do seem to work like normal prisons, at least sometimes. E.G. traps Blythe in an Everjail, but when you release him, he's back to normal. There's nothing special going on. It is weird, though, how all the Everjail prisoners have this spectral glow, as if to indicate that they're not really there, or that there's something magical about their existence. That's all the Everjail prisoners except Vike, however. He seems to be a normal-looking person. Actually, there's also Ordina, Liturgical Town, in which there are normal-looking Albinorics and Black Knife Assassins inside the Everjail. Outside the Everjail, there are spectral counterparts to both groups, and there are also spectral wolves, although they don't have a physical counterpart inside the jail. There's also spectral trees, but the trees are still spectral inside the jail. Okay, I still don't really understand how Everjails work, so let's get back to the central issue of Godefroy. He was a real person who really existed in the non-Everjail world at some point. So where did he come from? The Everjail he's in is called the Golden Lineage Everjail. The Golden Lineage is Godfrey and his offspring, so presumably Godefroy is one of those offspring, like Godwyn and Godric. Maybe Godefroy is an ancestor of Godric. After all, Godric seems to be overly concerned with proving himself to his forefathers, and he is supposedly the last of the Golden Lineage, according to Kenneth Haidt. Maybe Godefroy grafted himself, and then Godric thought that was really cool and copied him, down to all the hands and fingers. But hang on a second. Godric grafts himself specifically with limbs of Tarnished. It seems like there's something special about Tarnished that's necessary for grafting. So if Godefroy grafted himself with Tarnished, this would have had to happen after Godfrey and his kinfolk had their grace removed and were banished from the lands between. Actually, if Godfrey took his kinfolk on the Long March, why weren't Godwyn, Godefroy, and Godric also banished? Why didn't they become Tarnished? Putting that aside, Enya says that Marika's children warred, tainted by the strength of their runes, but none of them could become Elden Lord, and it's because of that that grace was extended to the Tarnished. It's grace that revives us and brings us to the lands between, so that implies the Tarnished only started to return once the Shattering War concluded or reached an impasse. But if that were true, it would imply that Godefroy couldn't graft himself until after the Shattering War. But that also doesn't make sense because Godefroy was captured after the first defense of Lendel, which presumably means before the second defense, which presumably means the war was still happening, which means the Tarnished hadn't returned yet. Well, maybe Godefroy grafted himself with the Tarnished that were left behind in a boat, as mentioned in the Rusted Anchor description. Or maybe you don't have to graft Tarnished. After all, the grafted scions seem to have bird wings and feathers grafted to them. That's also pretty weird. And who are they? Other members of the Golden Lineage? If they're related to Godric, why aren't they demigods like him? Was Godefroy a demigod? And does that mean Kenneth Haidt is wrong about Godric being the last of the Golden Lineage? Well, he is pretty clueless. But this still leaves some questions. If Godefroy was around during the Shattering, and he was a demigod of the Golden Lineage, how come he never got a Great Rune? Well, maybe Godric's Great Rune originally belonged to Godefroy. But then how did Godric get it if Godefroy was captured? If Godric inherited it somehow, when did Godefroy have the time to have a kid? If Godric was alive during the Shattering and Godefroy had the Anchor Rune, why didn't Godric get a different Great Rune as a demigod of the Golden Lineage? There's no issue with him having a Great Rune now, and since Godefroy and Godric appear identical, there's no reason to suppose that Godefroy couldn't also have one. Actually, Godefroy has about twice as much health as Godric, so if it were an issue of strength, he should be more likely to claim a Great Rune. Maybe he just didn't make it to the Erd Tree in time to grab a piece. Before Godric came to Stormvale, he was hounded from the capital, so that means he was in the capital, so maybe he was just there at the right time. According to Morgoth's intro cutscene, there's a normal-sized throne for Godric the Golden, presumably meaning he wasn't grafted yet. But hang on a minute, why doesn't Godefroy have a throne? If all the demigods were gathered together peacefully, that implies Godric had his throne before everybody started fighting and going their own way, at least before Morgoth took control of Lendel, and before Godric was hounded from the capital. But Godwyn doesn't have a throne either, so it would presumably be after Godwyn was killed. If Godric's throne originally belonged to Godefroy, then why would he give it up? If it was because he was captured, why would Lendel Knights be opposed to Godefroy, but be okay with Godric? Especially because the Dragon Cult was founded by Godwyn, who presumably was the ancestor of both Godefroy and Godric. If Godefroy was captured after Godric was hounded from the capital, what was Godefroy up to before then? And why didn't he get a Great Rune? And why capture Godefroy at all? Why not just kill him? Aside from all of that, how does one claim a Great Rune anyways? Enya says the Great Runes are handsome shards of the Elden Ring, so presumably the demigods only got the runes after the ring was shattered. That explains why Godwyn never had a Great Rune, because he was killed before that happened. Leaving aside the fact that Godwyn becomes a rune, the Tarnished acquires Great Runes by killing demigods. But no matter which runes you acquire or don't acquire, all of them seem to be present inside of Marika at the end of the game. Or inside of Radagon, rather. And then inside of Marika. But Radagon is Marika, although he's also a sword. There's also the benediction of the Great Runes on top of the Divine Towers, but you don't need that to repair the Elden Ring anyways. The Great Rune of the Unborn is already fully juiced, and you get it by killing Renala, who's not a demigod. Except it's also not Renala, because Renala's still alive afterwards. Also, that rune is inside the Amber Egg, and it also is the Amber Egg. Where did that rune come from anyway? Radagon gave Renala the Amber Egg. Was the rune inside it at that time? If he gave it to her before he left, does that mean shards of the ring could be extracted before the ring was shattered? Some people think it's Ranni's or Miquella's rune which they discarded, but either way there's a rune missing from the set. Miquella's probably makes more sense because the rune is tiny and golden, and it fits on the same side as Malenia's rune. The other pairs of siblings have similarly paired runes. Actually, Godric is the only one without a sibling. What if Godefroy were a sibling of Godric? Maybe even a twin? After all, there is weird stuff going on with twins. Miquella and Malenia are twins born from one god, the Radagon-Marika combo. But since Radagon is Marika, doesn't that mean the twins are essentially clones of Radagon and Marika? Plus, Miquella also might be Saint Trina, and his body in the Mogwyn cocoon looks like Morgott, and he also has a weird tree body inside the Haligtree roots. Malenia also seems to have daughters or offshoots in Millicent and her sisters, but the implication is that they just sprung up from the Aeonian bloom instead of the normal method of giving birth, if there is such a thing in Elden Ring. That's all pretty weird, but there's another pair of twins that might be even weirder, Darian and Devin. They have two separate bodies and two separate minds, or two separate wills going by the Japanese text, but they share a single soul, which for some reason means they don't stand together or speak to one another. For all of Darian's talk about the Erd Tree's honeyed rays of gold, Devin only appears underground, and the pose he strikes almost makes it seem like he's inhabiting the silver part of the twinned armor. Gold and silver parallel sunlight and night. For example, silver fireflies are found near water untouched by sunlight. Maybe there's something going on with sunlight that explains the strange duality of the D-twins? Maybe it also explains why guilty martyrs scream at night, and why deathbirds appear, and why the eclipsed sun holds destined death at bay. And maybe it also explains something about the black sky in the Everjails and the weirdness of that parallel reality. To be honest, I'm at the end of my rope. I just don't get it. I can't come up with a satisfying explanation for why Godefroy exists. If he were put there for narrative reasons, you would think that making him identical to Godric would make players ask questions, if not inspire in them doubt that Elden Ring's lore does, at the end of the day, make sense. If he's supposed to be a different person from Godric, why not change some little thing about him, just to make sure that's clear? Maybe changing the character model is too much work, but I can't imagine that it would be difficult to just switch out his axe. Even then, the fact that they're both grafted identically is frustrating, but why put him in the game at all? Is he really that important to the story? If the reason for putting him in was purely gameplay, that they wanted to give you another chance to fight Godric again, why go to the trouble of making him a different person, with a different name and an item description that makes it clear it's not just a spelling mistake? Why not just have some spirit of Godric? After all, nobody bats an eye when we fight Godfrey's golden spirit in the Erd Tree Sanctuary. We all just shrug our shoulders and say it's some magical spirit memory thing going on. So why not do the same for Godric's double? None of it makes sense. Why does Godefroy exist? The truth is that Godefroy is by no means the only weird thing concerning identity in Elden Ring. There are parts of Elden Ring so resistant to common sense that I and many others find ourselves questioning stupidly basic assumptions, like, are things and people themselves and not something else? At times, it's difficult not to be driven to madness. The popularity of recent videos like Mikola is Melina or Mikola is Torrent is a sign that the lore community has reached a maddening impasse, and the intuition that there is something very strange going on with who people are. There's Marika and Radigan, Mikola and St. Trina, Millicent and her sisters, Hyetta and Irina, Yura and Shabriri, Darian and Devon, Godefroy and Serash and Horalu, Malekith and Gurrank, Melina, the Glomide Queen, and more. People can be half-dead, living in death, reborn, reincarnated, soul transplanted, a dragon can take human form, humans can become part dragon, life can be blended together, there's inorganic life, there's 2 or 3 round tables, 8 or 9 different types of fire, 2 to 5 moons, time travel, mimicry, souls, spirits, phantoms, and everything else under the sun. The simplest way to make sense of all of this is just to conclude that Elden Ring has something to say about identity. Each of these cases might have some specific reason behind it in the story, but the only thing uniting all of them is a thematic connection. Like all of Miyazaki's stories, Elden Ring deals in poetic imagery and metaphors to express things which couldn't be properly expressed just through text. There are metaphors about death, sacrifice, suffering, struggle, vision, loyalty, leadership, and many more. Identity is just one more of these topics illustrated with Miyazaki's metaphorical paintbrush. And identity is a rich source of thematic material. Everyone struggles with issues of identity at some point in their life, so everyone can relate on some level to stories which dramatize identity conflicts. Think of Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Sora and Roxas. In day-to-day life, we tend to think of our identity as being consistent and indivisible, but in reality, we're never exactly the same person from moment to moment. The way you speak to your mother isn't how you speak to your boss. When you're hungry, angry, or in love, the way you act and even think can change quite radically. It's as if you're possessed by a pantheon of spirits, each with their own agenda. Our identities depend as much on context as they do intrinsic nature. Where we are, who we're with, and what we're doing all affect who we are in the moment. Sometimes the gap between different personas is too great, and we have to try to solve that divide, somehow integrate the different components of our identity and become whole. And that's why when a story exaggerates and dramatizes identity conflicts, we can all relate and enjoy the narrative on a deeper level. So a reasonable response to all this identity confusion in Elden Ring is just to say that the story is exploring themes of identity and leave it at that. Each one of these strange circumstances takes a different angle on identity conflict, turning metaphor into literal reality in its own unique way, but there's nothing behind all of these examples to connect them in terms of the plot. It's a purely thematic connection. That would be a reasonable conclusion. But for whatever reason, I just don't buy it. Call it intuition or madness. But I don't buy that there's not a bigger picture here. I think there must be some diegetic reason, a plot reason, behind at least most of these examples. Some primary cause that informs maybe not the direct circumstances of each example, but at least some fundamental conditions of the world by which such identity confusion is able to exist. So let's explore this purely hypothetical line of inquiry. Let's suppose that there is some primary cause behind all this identity confusion. Let's further suppose that this isn't just the basic conditions of Elden Ring's universe, but that something happened to make it this way. In literary and even psychological terms, identity isn't supposed to be all mixed up and confused. The goal of a protagonist or an individual is to integrate the pieces of their identity. Things that are broken should be repaired. Wholeness, completeness, harmony, and balance — this is the ideal state of things, the natural state. For things to be awkwardly divided and mixed up is a kind of imbalance. I would argue that in Miyazaki's stories in particular, there is the sense that the world has a kind of natural balance or equilibrium, and it's only the effect of parochial human desires that knocks it out of balance and causes most of the bad things in the story. Obviously, there's quite a bit of interpretation involved here, but let's just suppose that this primary cause behind the conditions which allow for identity confusion in the world is associated with a particular event, and that this event, in and of itself, has a preceding cause. It's the result of action taken by someone or something for wrongly motivated reasons. In other words, someone did something bad that knocked the world out of balance. If we were to search the story for this event, we would most likely be looking for three characteristics. First, it would most likely be early enough in the timeline to account for the most narratively important examples of identity confusion. Second, it would most likely be depicted using symbolic imagery of duality, symmetry, division, disjunction, etc., etc. Third, it would have to be an event with a scope of cosmic significance, something that can affect the fundamental nature of the world or the life therein. I propose that there are 4 events with sufficient cosmic significance for what we're looking for: the division of the One Great, the arrival of the Elden Beast, the foundation of the Golden Order, and the shattering of the Elden Ring. There are also 2 other major events which have great narrative significance: the marriage of Radagon and Rennala and the assassination of Godwyn the Golden, but I don't think either of these has the kind of grand scope we're looking for. In addition, Radagon and Rennala's marriage would, if anything, be more associated with harmony and conjoinment rather than division and confusion. Godwyn's assassination is a bit trickier because the nature of Ranni and Godwyn's half-deaths does reflect the kind of imagery of duality and unnatural division that we'd be looking for, and Deathroot has a widespread effect across the lands between, but I would still argue that the scope of this event is too limited on a metaphysical level. So let's return to the 4 events that I mentioned. The obvious candidate is the shattering of the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring is something like the metaphysical system of rules that govern the world, or at least the life within it, so it makes intuitive sense that if the Elden Ring is broken, it could break something fundamental about identity. However, this would be too late in the timeline to explain several of the examples we would want it to explain. Most importantly, Radagon and Marika, since Radagon existed well before the Shattering, and was arguably already one with Marika, at least at the point that she shattered the ring. Also, although shattering the ring comports with the imagery of division that we're looking for, it doesn't quite match the idea of duality that we might want to find, although that may not be an important characteristic. However, even if shattering the ring was the primary cause that we're looking for, it wouldn't provide an obvious explanation of the mechanic by which identity was divided. It would leave us with something too vague to arrive at a satisfying conclusion. That's not really an argument against it being the case, but for now let's continue searching. The division of the One Great exemplifies the imagery that we're looking for, and Hayeta even frames it as a mistake, which tracks with the idea that this primary cause we're looking for is wrongly motivated somehow. However, there's good reason to be suspicious of Hayeta. The Frenzied Flame is not painted in a favorable light, so it's unlikely that this so-called mistake is really a mistake in the way that we're looking for. Furthermore, if the division of the One Great were the primary cause behind identity confusion, that would basically take us back to square one. This is just how the world is set up from the beginning, part of the background conditions of reality, which is somewhat unsatisfying as an explanation. In addition, it would be kind of impersonal. The motivations of the greater will are somewhat abstract, which wouldn't match the theme of parochial human desire opposed to natural balance that we're looking for. The delivery of the Elden Beast into the lands between is similarly impersonal, and therefore somewhat unsatisfying as an explanation. And I can't think of a good way to frame this as a kind of mistake that knocks the world out of balance. If anything, the Elden Beast is the living incarnation of order, and that doesn't easily translate to causing identity confusion. There is a way to make it work. Order is about dividing and distinguishing, about defining opposites, but it takes some leaps to get there, and I don't think this event quite fits the bill. That leaves us with the foundation of the Golden Order and the removal of the Rune of Death. This is presumably the action of a person. Although it's never directly stated, it's generally assumed that Marika removed the Rune of Death, since the Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god. This would be an action of cosmic significance taken by our central character and leader, which follows the pattern set up by Miyazaki's previous stories, in which the leader of the world causes ruin as a result of a character flaw. It's one of the most important events in the story in terms of setting up the conditions of the world we now inhabit, and it's arguably the biggest reason the world is out of balance. It would be early enough in the timeline to account for most, if not all, of the examples of identity confusion, and it carries the appropriate connotations of duality and division that we're looking for. Life versus death, or light and shadow. Even visually, the Rune of Death appears to be an inversion, or perhaps a completion, of Marika's Elden Rune. Furthermore, many of the examples of identity confusion are directly related to the Golden Order and Destined Death. Melina's purpose is to unleash Destined Death, and she'll deliver it to you if you become the Lord of Chaos. Radagon is a leal hound of the Golden Order, and the confusion of his identity as Marika directly concerns the founding principle of the Golden Order, that Marika is the one true god. Destined Death is the forbidden shadow contrasted with the Golden Order's golden light, which parallels how Empyreans like Marika and Ranni have shadowbound beasts, a part of their very being. Malekith even acts as a vessel for Destined Death, in an analogous way to how Marika is a vessel for the Elden Ring. The twins Darian and Devin were reviled as accursed beings by everyone except the Golden Order, who accepted them. Godwyn's cloned eyes and body manifests through Deathroot, which is literally the Rune of Death. Even our Roundtable hold seems to be contingent on Destined Death. Our hub version exists outside of this world, but when Destined Death is unleashed, it fades in color and burns, as if its reality is falling apart. It's not a slam dunk, but the foundation of the Golden Order seems to be the most promising candidate for the primary cause that we're looking for. However, there's still something missing from this picture. The Rune of Death isn't called the Rune of Identity, so it's not obvious how these things would be connected. I still don't fully grasp exactly what the Rune of Death does. Many people think that it is just the concept of death, full stop. When it was removed from the Elden Ring, it just stopped everyone from dying. That's the narrative context for why enemies respawn in the game. Of course, some enemies never respawn, and arguably we can kill demigods before the Rune of Death is unleashed. In an interview, Miyazaki said that the immortality of the Tarnished stems from the power of the guidance of grace, but the immortality of the demigods is different. That's associated with the removal of Destined Death from the Elden Ring. Plus, there's something else weird about the Rune of Death. Deathroot, which is the Rune of Death, seems to make dead people live in death, which almost seems like the opposite of what it should do. The Rune of Death is also called Destined Death, so some people think it may just govern death by old age. People can still be killed by other means. But this explanation still leaves many unanswered questions. This is the point in my thinking where I don't know how to continue. I believe that the removal of Destined Death somehow caused a whole bunch of strange circumstances regarding identity in the Lands Between. I can't really defend that idea, it's more of an intuition than anything else. But even if that were true, I don't understand well enough how Destined Death works to reach a satisfying conclusion. This is as far as I can go, while still maintaining the pretense that I'm using some kind of logic. So, before I conclude this video, let's leave logic behind and travel to some truly insane territory. Indulge me on this, because there's no way to say it without sounding crazy. Even if I fully understood what I was saying, it would be totally bonkers. So here goes. What if death isn't just a concept or a process, but a person? What I mean to say is, what if death is the person you are destined to be? I can't phrase this properly, if there is a good way to phrase it, so don't get caught up in the specific words and just follow the direction I'm pointing towards. Yura dies and then becomes Shabriri. Irina dies and then Hyetta appears. Darian dies and then Devin takes over. Sarash dies and then Godfrey becomes Horalu. In each case, there's a chain of causality involving death. Let's not forget the most provocative item description in all of Elden Ring, the Helfin's Steeple. The description tells us that a spirit world exists inhabited by the dead, or at least it did exist. The Helfin's Steeple seems to be intimately connected to the Deathbirds. Deathbirds were the keepers of Ghostflame in the time when there was no Erd Tree, and making the, I think, safe assumption that the Golden Order wasn't around before the Erd Tree, that would have been before the Golden Order. But if that's true, that means in the time that destined death was still part of the Elden Ring, people wouldn't be just annihilated when they died. They would carry on some other kind of existence in a spirit world. Imagine this. Here's you living your life, the arc of it spanning across time. Then you die, leading a different sort of existence, completing the circle. What if that different existence is actually a different version of you? A reflection, or a shadow, a mirror image, an inversion. Maybe even one that moves through time in the opposite direction, a path of regression instead of causality. Death is inevitable. Death is the future. Death comes to all of us as sure as night follows day. And if we lead some sort of different existence after death, or in death, then we are destined to transform, to become someone else. If death were removed, you would be eternally yourself in one order of events, but your other self might exist outside of that order. Let's go even further. Radagon is Marika, but when Marika talks to Radagon, she says, "Thou art yet to become me, thou art yet to become a god." It seems unlikely Marika is totally okay with this, because Marika and Radagon disagree about shattering the Elden Ring. Maybe I'm reading too much into this dialogue, but it sounds as if she's talking down to him, not like they're two conspirators with the same goals. What if Marika is destined to become Radagon? What if being Radagon, or Radagon being her, is her fate? Maybe removing the Rune of Death, and even shattering the Elden Ring, is because not only did she not want to die, but she didn't want to become someone else. When Millicent removes the needle from her flesh, she says, "If I am to flower into something other than myself, I would rather rot into nothingness as I am." All of that aside, let me just ask one question. Is it really so crazy to imagine that we're dealing with an utterly ridiculous time travel plot? All three Dark Souls games involved time travel, and something similar was present in both Bloodborne and Sekiro. George R.R. Martin has used time travel in both his science fiction and fantasy novels. We're dealing with a world in which fate and prophecy are real, and the Rune of Death is hidden outside of time. The laws of the Golden Order are causality and regression, which could imply forward and backward movement through time. The stars once guided fate, and the Elden Ring was sent to the lands between on a golden star. The fate writ in the night skies had been fettered by the Golden Order, and the Golden Order was created when destined death was plucked from it. Destined death is fate's death, and fate determines events in the future. You can only cheat your fate in the center of Farum Azula, and the very fact of that location proves that backwards time travel isn't prohibited by the mechanics of Elden Ring's universe. In Dark Souls 3, the repair sorcery said, "Light is time," and I wonder if a similar idea might be at play in Elden Ring. Light defines objects. It divides and distinguishes, like how Shibriri describes the Erd Tree. It creates disparity because light cannot exist without shadow. I believe that light defines form in Elden Ring, and gold preserves form because it channels light. This is why gold excrement never decays, and why the Erd Tree can preserve memories, and why Farum Azula is stuck in both time and sunlight. The hub version of the Round Table Hold exists outside of this world. Somehow it's correlated with the Erd Tree because it burns in sync with the Erd Tree. Remembrances are hewn into the Erd Tree, so a natural interpretation is that the hub Round Table is a kind of memory of the real thing, preserved in the Erd Tree's golden light. But what if it's not just a memory existing alongside the real world, but literally in the past? When we arrive at the real thing in Lendel, we can find the hammer that Hugh uses in our hub, as if it were abandoned there at some point. Inside the inner chamber, we find the coded sword, which says, "Champions would gather at the Round Table Hold in days long past, when the two fingers were masters of oration, their flesh yet full of vigor." But where are the Round Table's two fingers now? They don't have a counterpart in the real world. They only exist outside of this world in this strange world of memory. In the DLC trailer, we see a land of shadow hidden by Marika's veil. We seem to be faced with one of America's children, a horrific war, and an entire country, none of which seem to be referenced in the base game, as if they've been expunged from history. But what if they're not just expunged from history, but literally don't exist in the Golden Order? Because the land is veiled in shadow, it isn't preserved in the memories stored within the Erdtree's golden light. It never even happened in this timeline. What if it's not just the place where the Erdtree was born, but also the place that it will die? The inevitable outcome of the Rune of Death branching throughout the world and strangling the life out of the Golden Tree. A place of both death and birth, where causality and regression lead to the same point, the conclusion of a perfect ring. Finally, let's return to Godefroy. In the Sainted Hero's grave, a message reads, "Shadow bathes in light and knows weakness." Here, enemies made of pure shadow can be given physical form using the light of an Erdtree sigil. This is one of only 2 places in the game with this particular mechanic, and in the light of the DLC trailer, it seems more important than just a throwaway gimmick, especially considering the presence of a snake-adorned duelist. At the end of this dungeon, you fight a Knight of Zamor, and what does he drop? None other than the ancient Dragon Knight Kristoff Ashes, the only item in the game to reference Godefroy the Grafted, a double of Godric who emerges from a sinister rift in a parallel dimension where the sky is pitch black and the Erdtree is invisible. So what does this all mean? I'll leave you to come to your own conclusions. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you agreed with what I said in this video, please dislike, unsubscribe, and promptly check yourself into the nearest asylum. And most of all, never forget, Godefroy is the key to everything.